Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with the session on invasive alien species. I'm happy to see quite a lot of faces. I thought everyone would just disappear on Friday, but so thank you for hanging on and attending the session. So if you want translations, there are QR codes. There was a QR code here, but for the translations, should you show it again? QR code? Okay. So if anyone needs translations, you can just scan the QR code here. And then we're going to head off with me as the first speaker. So what I would like to do is talk you through the task group a little bit on invasive alien species. So we have kicked off last year, and I just want to give you an overview for where we are. The goal of this task group is, of course, to improve the TDWG standards for focusing on invasive alien species. The original idea was to focus on management data. And what do I mean with management data? It's people going into the field managers, observing invasive alien species and taking them out, so removing species. But we felt that there's a need to broaden the scope. So we also focusing on occurrence data and on checklist data. So the timeline, at this point, we're still gathering use cases. So we contact people involved in invasive alien species research, and we want to know what are they doing. And we want to see their databases. We want to see how they store data, vocabularies. So that's a use case. And then each case, at this point, we are reviewing this use case to see what is lacking in the Darwin Core standards. So we use the current Darwin Core data package, and we compare it with what people actually store in their databases. And to identify the use cases, we took some time to send around a survey, and we had 176 responses, but for the specific data standard part, so it's combining questions about standards with questions about the use of GBIF. So specifically for the standard part, we had 62 useful responses, and it's still open. So we're gathering responses from more people because I did a quick analysis, and about 95% of the responses were focusing on terrestrial species and 75% on plants. So anyone working on marine species, vertebrates, invertebrates, whatever group that are not plants, I really invite you to just go through our survey. And what is also surprising, well, it wasn't actually really surprising, is that 30% indicated to have open data, but if you browse through the details, you can see that they're just not fair. They're not findable, accessible, not interoperable, and not reusable. So there's just a small minority of the data that's actually open and fair. So I went through the use cases, and I had a few questions popping up at this point already. So if we want to improve the Darwin Core data package for invasive alien species, I think we need to ask the question, why do we want to share the data, and what do we want to share the data? And this why is really important, because I've always looked at the Darwin Core data package from the point of view that we want to publish data to GBIF, but we can also use what we develop as a data exchange format between different actors. So not only by publishing it and making it available on repositories, but just Institute A informing partner B of what they are doing. So, and that's a different question, because there are things, for instance, with respect to planning of management actions, Do you want to have this data openly on GBIF, yes or no? Do you want to have information about the time spent on an action or the costs of that action? That's maybe not relevant to publish it on GBIF, but it's very relevant to exchange between the different actors. And then with respect to this, so why will determine what we are sharing between the different actors. And so I had a look at the structure of the data. So in the highest event, there's a project level here, and people want to share information about a project. So one of the things I found that is currently lacking in the Darwin Core data package is information about the goal of, for instance, a management action. So now I should also say I'm focusing on management actions, but the work will be broader. It will also focus on occurrence data and checklist data, but specifically for management actions, there's not really a way to report on the goal of a project. Do we want, for instance, complete eradication of a species? Do we want containment of a species? This is something field managers want to exchange, but it's currently just not possible, in my opinion. And then, so if you go and zoom in a little bit on the lower level, what field managers do, they go into the fields, they observe invasive alien species, and the next step is to remove that species. So imagine you publish that data to GBIF, and it says, for instance, 4 muskrat species on this specific location on this specific date. But is that an observation or is that an action for removing these species? So if you just see that record on GBIF and it says 4 muskrats seen in this location at that time, are they still there? Because probably they just removed it. And you might think that they are still there, but they're not. So they were removed. And this is also one of the tricky things at this point, how to indicate that something has been removed. So I had a chat with John McGeoch about it, and we were considering using the event type fields just to indicate. So event type would be removal, for instance, but that was kind of a brain dump, and we'll still have to refine what we have focused on in that conversation. Another one I already mentioned is the planning of an event. So in the Darwin Core data package and Darwin Core, an event in my head has always been like something that took place. But what about future events? Does the event core, the event class cover future events? That's a very relevant question if you want to share information between managers, what we are planning to do. Project status is about, is a project still ongoing? Where are we? Is it finalized? Does it need follow-up, for instance? Also some things that were not, it was not very clear to me if we could report this using Darwin Core data packages. And then another thing, information about protocols. So there's now a protocol class in the Darwin Core data package. But for me, it still feels like a class where you can just lump a lot of information together. And I feel there's a need to exchange information about specific materials that have been used, the brand of that material. So these are very like specific details, but when I see the databases, all this information is included, and when I speak to the managers, they do actually want to know what has been used, and especially chemical substances are a tricky thing, because when I went through the details of the data package, there's something like agents that are people doing some stuff, but it could also be machines. But a chemical is like something different. So it's a philosophical thing. What is a chemical? So I have been like opening that box, and suddenly I regret opening that one. But it's something to have in the back of our heads. And then, so control status is a bit the same thing as the target of a project, but then on a lower level. So on a higher level, you want to know what is the goal of the project, eradication, containment, but you also want to know for each step in that line, when you did an action, did we actually eradicate it? Although you cannot always know 100%, but and then just a minor detail is where you could indicate whether a location you have visited is actually a private area or not. Yeah, I'm finishing here, but these numbers here is just when I went through the result of that survey I just discussed in the beginning. I found that like almost 70% of the people working on management actions report on these protocols. 60% reports on whether it's eradicated or not, where we want to contain it. So there's gaps, but there's also a need to exchange that information. So that kind of confirms that we are doing some useful stuff. Yeah, with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you want to get involved in the task group, you can always contact me. There's a QR code if you want to complete the survey. Thank you for your attention. I think there's not time for questions here, but we are also having a small informal coming together after this meeting with the TDWG task group, but also with the GBIF task group on invasive alien species. Forgot to mention that, but if you are interested in the topic, I recommend you joining us in the discussion. And with this, I would like to introduce the next speaker with Quentin Groom. Who is talking about checklists and workflows. And thank you.
Hello. My name is Quentin Groom, as Lynn says. And if I can get this to work, yeah. Oops, I already skipped my introduction. Yeah, so I'm talking about alien species checklisting. Something that's very useful, in actual fact, more useful than perhaps you might at first think. But it comes out of the One Stop project, and I put a few leaflets out there if any of you are interested, and the stickers and everything. And this started in January last year. We still have another 2.5 years to run. And yeah, we're trying to build workflows, the whole data lifecycle effectively from detection to action. Well, let me explain on here. So we have detection of using AI and eDNA, and we're trying to get all those records into GBIF as quickly as possible so that we can disseminate those data that people need to know. We also have modeling aspects and other aspects to do with the prioritization of action on invasive species, because obviously we have limited resources in terms of time and money, and so it needs to be prioritized. And we also have a pillar related to socio-political action, because invasive species and the causes of invasive species are so mixed up in what people do and the policies around biodiversity. Our project is very much an open science project. We try and do everything fair and open. We make all our software and data open on common archives. So why do we need species checklists, and why are they important? Well, for one thing, they're authoritative, as opposed to observations, which you don't really know who they came from, and you don't know whether they can identify things properly. A checklist has been checked, preferably by a taxonomic expert, and so you can trust it, at least more than you can some other kind of data. It's very useful baseline data, so you can look at changes, but you can also derive indicators from that. So, for instance, we have the Global Biodiversity Target 6 indicator, which is to reduce the introduction of invasive alien species by 50% and minimize their impact. Now, that's a very short sentence, and it's extremely difficult to tease out exactly how we're going to achieve that, particularly as we don't really know what 100% is, so finding out what 50% is quite tricky. But it's a very good goal to go with, and we will try and do our best on that. One of the indicators for that goal is the rate of establishment of invasive alien species. And I underline establishment there because you need to know whether, when people have recorded those invasive species, whether they are established. And as you probably know, there's a very big gradient between a plant being planted in a street to being wildly invasive. Unfortunately, 6 years ago, we published this paper on changing the Darwin Core standard to include degree of establishment. So it's based upon a ranking of invasiveness by Blackburn et al., or stages of invasiveness, and that's hierarchical as well. As you can see, there's A is the sort of native species there, but B is separated in 3 categories of cultivated and or a bit more released. And then the C and D, because you could choose one of these categories to go into Darwin Core to explain how established it was, but sometimes it's not always easy to tell what the difference is. That's why hierarchical classification helps. So we can tell what's established, and we can put establishment into our checklists. In Belgium, we have a system for checklists which is automated to semi-automated that Lien actually made. It allows taxonomists to maintain their own checklists within things like spreadsheets, and then we create that, we convert that into much more tidy data than a checklist, than a spreadsheet, sorry. We version it on GitHub and use scripts to turn that into Darwin Core so that we can publish it on GBIF, and we also get versioning on GBIF as well through the IPT. And that means you can cite everybody's list. They have their own list on there and it's citable, but we can also cite a particular version of that list as well. So OneStop also collects observation data from iEcology, computer vision, AirDNA, and citizen science. And we combine that with the list data because those lists are more the authoritative one rather than the observations. We're making new lists, and we're trying to roll out the Belgian way of semi-automating the process to Romania, Cyprus, and Portugal as well. And anyone else, in actual fact, who would like to try our methodology too. That means it's all repeatable, and that's very important for what we do. We want to make a system that we can keep on using after OneStop finishes. It's also versioned, as I mentioned, and it's all open as well. So as Lien mentioned, we work on the FAIR principles and open reproducible. So what will all of this achieve? Well, there's a big lag between data being collected. We've seen lags in terms of identifications people have been talking about, but we've seen other kinds of lags in terms of just the effort it takes to convert data and publish it onto GBIF. And sometimes it can take more than 2 years for an invasive species record to be disseminated to the community who need to know. That might be down to scientists sitting on data and hiding data until they can publish it, and that's happened in a few headline cases. But we want to reduce that lag as much as we possibly can. We also want to give countries control of their data, and that's somewhat political, but it means that if a country has a checklist that they feel ownership of, they can also feel ownership of the problem as well, and trying to reduce that. We want to work with the GRIS community. So if you don't know about GRIS, it's the Global Register of Indigenous and Invasive Species, which is done at a global level through the IUCN. And we would like to improve the way GRIS does things, like including establishment and also including the first record date and things like that. But that's a conversation we still need to have. We want to give these timely notifications to people, and OneStop is producing an alert system as well for people who can sign up to get alerts from GBIF to our system of any invasive species in any place they find interesting. That might be a smaller area like a nature reserve or something like this, but it also might be a country as well. We want to harmonize what we're doing with impact data, and I haven't really talked about that. That's a whole other subject. But obviously, knowing what impact data there are is very useful for that prioritization, because if something's not causing any impact, then you're going to prioritize it quite low. And obviously, a high impact species, you want to prioritize quite high, at least if you can do something about it. We're also very keen to provide the provenance of data, both to make sure that these checklists are authoritative, but also to give credit to all of the people who contribute to them, because there are actually hundreds of people. So I've actually pretty much finished, I think. I just shout out to all my partners. Lien is actually the person leading this work in One Stop, but she didn't want to be up here the whole time, so I'm just filling up. And thank you for your attention.
Unfortunately, there's no room for questions. So with this, I would like to call our next speaker, which is Hanno Seebens, who is focusing on DASCO workflow. Maybe, Hanno, you can introduce yourself a bit. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all here on last day of the conference. My name is Hanno Seebens. I'm based in Germany, and today I would like to introduce you a workflow which I developed together with a colleague, Lien Kaplan. And the workflow is about the integration of checklists of alien species with occurrence data, such as those based on provided by GBIF and OBIS, to assess the distribution of alien species at a higher resolution. I should have checked that. But before I come to that, I would like to briefly introduce you to the topic. So why are we actually talking about biological invasions? Maybe you've heard of that before. Biological invasion has been repeatedly identified as a major driver of biodiversity loss. There have been several biodiversity assessments reporting that. The probably most prominent one is the closer. Okay, thank you. Yeah. The most prominent one was probably the best invasive alien species, the best global assessment released in 2019. There was a more recent one with a specific topic on biological invasions, which states that there are more than 39,000 alien species now recorded worldwide. We have information about documented impacts for more than 3,500 species. These species we would then call invasive alien species. And these species produce costs of more than $400 billion annually. But all of these numbers are vast underestimates because we are lacking data. According to IUCN, 60% of all global species extinctions are caused partly or solely by invasive alien species, so in combination with other drivers, and 16% solely by invasive alien species. So I think we all agree that we should do something about that threat. And the most basic information we actually need for that is the distribution of that species. And as Quentin already mentioned, checklist is a very valuable basis for that. Also, because checklists are comparatively easy to compile. So it's just a list of species for regions. So you don't need information about abundances, traits, or impacts or so on. So information about the spatial distribution is most comprehensive and most up-to-date in regional checklists. But still, you see on the maps there's a lot of gray areas. So and many checklists are lacking also, and probably all checklists are incomplete. The problem is that for assessing biological invasions and managing invasive alien species, we often need information at finer scale, more granular information. So I thought it would be a good idea to combine the power of checklists with the power of occurrence records as provided with GBIF and OBIS. And that's the reason why we came up and developed a workflow which we called DASCO. DASCO is short for downscaling alien species checklist based on occurrence records. And the individual steps of the workflow are here shown in green. But actually, the workflow is pretty straightforward. So it's not really very complicated. What it basically does is it takes checklists from a database of alien species, and then for a certain region, and then extracts the occurrence record from open platforms like from GBIF and OBIS for this species and region. So if you would have a list for Colombia, for example, of species, then it would extract all occurrence record for these species from Colombia and treats them as being alien populations of these species. Then you get a bunch of data. Okay, we have to clean the data, so it gets reduced, but still you end up usually with a lot of data. And then you have these higher resolution data, these point-wise occurrence maps, which you then can re-aggregate if you want to basically any spatial delineation you would like to use. Also one which was not used before. So that is an example, a case study which we published in that paper. So as an input variable, we use the Zinus database, in this case Zinus 2.0. The Zinus database is a compilation of other data sets which all provide checklists of alien species. And you see all these acronyms here behind the term Zinus, which list the different databases, which are, for example, the GLONAV database, which is for alien plants, Gavia for alien birds, Dharma for alien mammals, and so on. So all based on checklists. And sorry, Melodie, for misspelling GRISP. That was slipped through my fingers. And if you want to hear more about how the Zinus database is generated, we can stay longer because Manuela will talk later in this session about the generation of the Zinus database and the major extension, which is going to be released soon. So if you apply the workflow to this data set, we end up with more than 30 million occurrence records and a map like the one we see here on the right. And you see the typical biodiversity biases with most records coming from Western Europe and North America. You also see the typical issues like borders, which are lining up very well with the amount of records. So if you look in Central Asia as Kazakhstan, for example, here you see a very clear separation of the biodiversity data. Still, it's an interesting representation of alien species records. And you can now overlay that with other delineations with a spatial layer. And for example, to identify checklists for other regions like marine ecoregions, which I've tried here. So by overlaying that, you should also implement some restrictions. So when is actually a species considered to be present in that region? There are all these issues with the data, of course, but still this is a way to generate a checklist for a region where there was no checklist before. So if that is a true one, that's another question, but it's a basis probably for further checking. What is interesting for that specific figure is that there are still many white areas, particularly for the marine ecoregions. And that means that there's no single record which made it through the workflow and through the threshold which I set. So there's still many missing, maybe also because of the use of the data sets which I use here. There's another case study where we use that data is we were interested in understanding or comparing the number of alien species on lands managed by indigenous people. So we use layers of indigenous people's land and identified the number of alien species for each individual grid cell on land falling on indigenous people's land or other land types, made a comparison. And the figure here shows the land managed by indigenous peoples, and the color indicates the number of species there. And then we try to make a comparison of the grid cells, so which are on lands managed by indigenous peoples and other, which you see in the probably not see in the back of my back. And it is a bit difficult to make these comparisons because what cells you would like to consider, but we can compare cells with similar, can also define characteristics. For example, comparing cells only with the same number of GBIF records on indigenous people's lands and others, or what we did all kinds of combinations. For example, comparing only cells within the same region, like Australia, the same number of GBIF records, and the same land cover type or something. You could actually come up with any combination you would like to have. Long story short, at the end, it turns out that the number of alien species was always lower on on indigenous people's land. which was a very nice result and very clear result as well. But this is just a case study how the data could be used. There are, of course, many limitations associated with that. These are just three major ones. So one is the pure accuracy of some of the occurrence records have. So it might be that the assignment of occurrence record to a certain area is wrong or it's false. And this is particularly problematic for small polygons. So don't even think about applying that to rivers, for example. The database is, of course, really an issue which is inherent in the data. So this is problematic for making cross-continental comparisons or comparisons across taxonomic groups. And what caused the biggest headache for me so far and still unsolved is the deviating invasion status for some species and regions. So a species might be both alien and introduced within the same region, which is particularly problematic for large countries like USA with very different ecosystems. You can solve that by going into finer resolution with the federal state, but you of course need data for that. There are also other limitations, of course. So it's far from being perfect, but I still think that this is an interesting approach to analyze the spatial distribution of alien species at a higher resolution. The data set is available on Zenodo. The code is available on GitHub, and I'm very happy to talk about if you have any questions about that. If you have ideas for improving that, I'm very, very happy and open for collaboration. So if there is anything you would like to talk about, please catch me here or write me an email afterwards. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you for this presentation. So we're on a really tight schedule here. So again, no room for questions. Sorry for that, but please come and find us after the session. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Nigel Taylor. It's a virtual, it's a recorded one. I'll give the floor to the recording. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for joining this session and for the opportunity to speak. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm Nigel Taylor. I'm a research associate at Cambridge University in the UK, and I'll be talking today about a recent project to develop a unified framework for reporting invasive alien species management projects. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that this has been a real team effort with a core team from Cambridge University, IUCN, and the Tropical Biology Association, all within the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. We've also had input from more than 70 workshop participants. I'll explain in a bit more detail later, but their input has really kind of enriched the process and made for a much better final product. So we're thinking in this session and in this presentation about invasive alien species. Here's some examples. I'm sure you're familiar with at least some of these species. So this slide is really to highlight the diversity of these invasive species. And our framework is designed to apply to all invasive species in all habitats, all ecosystems, terrestrial, freshwater, marine, mammals, birds, microbes, everything. But just so we're all on the same page, this is the definition of invasive alien species. The organisms have been introduced by people outside their natural range. They become established and dispersed and are generating some kind of impact. And the key point for this presentation is that those impacts on both biodiversity and on people tend to be negative. So that's the real driver for managing invasive alien species in many cases. There are several options for managing invasive alien species throughout the invasion process. Things like biosecurity to prevent species being transported or introduced in the first place, through to mitigating impacts through things like habitat restoration and human healthcare as well in the end. Generally, as we move through the invasion process, management becomes less effective and less cost effective. So it's preferable to manage species early on in the process whenever we can. But sometimes we face a situation where species have already been introduced, they've already established, already spread. So we're trying to manage invasive species in the wild through things like containment, suppression, and eradication. And it's this management of wild invasive species that's the focus of the rest of this presentation, because that's where we focus development of the framework. And when we're thinking about this kind of management, three key questions come to mind. Understanding what management is being done, what management works and what management doesn't work, and what's cost effective. Answering these questions will help inform decisions about invasive species management, so we can choose the most effective and cost-effective actions, help us to track progress towards global and local targets about invasive species management, and also helps with public communications to explain what's going on and justify why we're doing certain actions, often with public money. But we think there's several problems, challenges with the current evidence base around these questions. For one, there's not much long-term monitoring of outcomes. If it's done at all, it tends to be 1 or 2 years within a project cycle, perhaps because people are not quite sure what they should be monitoring. Even when monitoring is carried out, we think the results, the learnings from that are not shared as much as they could be. Knowledge often remains within organisations, in internal reports, or even stuck on field notepads. And then finally, even when knowledge is shared, it's not shared in a standard format or using standard terminology. And this can make it really difficult to draw lessons from across different studies and to synthesize all the evidence we're accumulating. And this is where we think a standardized reporting framework comes in and might help to solve some of these problems. So the framework could help to mobilize data, provides a ready-made template for recording and reporting, which perhaps reduces a barrier to entry. You don't have to come up with your own new framework for a project. Framework can also ensure that reported data is useful, shared in a standard format, so it's easier to synthesize across different projects. And it also provides a checklist of key details and contextual factors that are important in interpreting results from a project. Something like applying herbicide, the outcomes are really hard to interpret unless you report details like the dose, the chemical used, the time of year that the herbicide was applied. And so the framework can help make sure that all those details are reported for any given project. And I'll just briefly mention here that we've also been thinking about how this framework might support an open access online repository and platform for data entry and visualization. Those will really help to contribute to making data findable and accessible. I don't really have time to talk about that in much more detail. I'll touch on it a bit later, but that's kind of the long-term vision. So now I'll spend a couple of minutes briefly describing the process we used to create the framework. So the first step was to create an initial draft framework, largely based on the expert knowledge within the core project team and our experience of carrying out monitoring and reporting on invasive species management projects. We supplemented this with a review of existing platforms, exploring the different fields that they contain, how they compared to our expert judgment. You might be wondering why we bothered to create this new framework if all these platforms with their own frameworks already exist. Partly because these frameworks suffer from some of the problems I touched on earlier. For example, they don't report things in the same way. There's no standardized reporting format. So it's hard to synthesize data across these platforms. Many of them kind of have a specific focus, a geographic area, a species group, and many of them are out of date, not updated, kind of, and incomplete as well. So it'd be good to have a centralized global framework that can be put towards that global database and repository I mentioned. The animation works good. So this was an overview of the results that we got from that review of existing platforms. Don't worry about all the details here. Basically, you have the different platforms on the left-hand side here in the rows. You have different data fields, invasive species, the target invasive species, site, project location, that kind of thing, are in the columns here. So you'll see some fields are common across platforms, things like the location, the target invasive species. They're included in pretty much every platform. It's fundamental information we need to know about an invasive species management project. Some fields are less common. Things like the costs of the management project are not included in many existing platforms. So that's perhaps an area where our framework is going to fill some gaps that other platforms don't cover. And there's also, in this process, we uncovered some interesting unique fields that are only included in 1 or 2 of these platforms. For example, explaining your justification for a course of action, explaining or speculating on reasons for success or failure of an action. And we've incorporated some of these questions, often those more narrative questions, into our framework. We think they record some really important information. So we've taken inspiration from these existing platforms. And the next step was to take that initial framework into workshops with invasive species stakeholders, where we could refine it together. We had a couple of workshops online to capture people in different time zones around the world. And we had one workshop in Cambridge in the UK as well. And in those workshops, we spent some time thinking about the overall structure of the framework. We're asking about the right kinds of topics. We also spent some time thinking about the details. What kinds of questions are we asking? How are those questions phrased? What were the response options? And this shows you the distribution of the workshop participants, where they're currently working. So we had over 70 participants from more than 30 different countries. This included academics, people working at NGOs, policy organisations, field practitioners. So we really tried to maximise diversity in various different senses to get a true reflection of the invasive species community. The next step was a bit of testing. So we tried extracting data from existing papers, project reports using the framework, and carried out a few additional tweaks to the framework, typically to the response options, definitions, exact phrasing of questions. And the final step, which will be happening imminently, will be to send that revised framework back out to all the workshop participants, so they can have a final check, final say, we can make any final tweaks. Obviously, even once that's done, the framework is not completely set in stone. It will be modified and evolve as it's used in practice. And now, the bit you've probably been waiting for, I'll give you an insight into the framework. What does it contain? What does it look like? The framework contains 8 main sections. These are all questions about a particular invasive species management project. And then these are just some examples of the kinds of questions we're asking within each section. This is not a complete list by any means, and I won't go through everything in detail here, just to highlight some key points. One is that the framework allows you to identify linked projects and parent programs, so you can highlight those relationships between projects. Second, there are questions about practical details, specific details of the action carried out. We find it quite tricky to find the balance here between asking lots of questions to capture all those key details versus making the framework too time-consuming, too complicated to complete. Actually, it was really hard to design specific questions that applied to every different situation. So we've kind of taken a middle line in the end. There's a few structured questions to pull out those details, but also space to add additional details as free text responses later. We recognise that there can be multiple different goals of an invasive species project. So the framework allows you to record goals and outcomes related to invasive species, native species, ecosystems, and socioeconomic aspects as well. And monitoring of outcomes tends to be is kind of structured in quite qualitatively at the moment. So you report whether a particular outcome increased, decreased, or didn't change. We've left quantitative reporting for either the original papers and reports or for other databases that can be linked to databases produced using this framework. One final thing to point out here is that for most sections, the ones in black in the yellow box here, you can just answer once for a project. Project has one name, one set of dates, one duration, one location, one set of coordinates or polygon that encompasses the whole project. But the ones in blue, sections in blue, realize you might want to answer multiple times for any particular project. And the framework allows you to do that. You can answer the questions on target invasive species, on different cost components. You can enter multiple rows of data using the framework. And then very quickly, just to give you a look at one of the sections in detail. So let's take actions, for example. So this here is a snapshot of the framework for the actions section, or at least part of the actions section. Got the different questions listed down here. And obviously each is numbered, and those numbers can act as an index to link between different databases produced using the framework. For each question, we've defined data entry options, and they tend to be discrete categories that we've predefined. That helps to when we're analysing and interpreting the data later. Where possible, we've used categories from Darwin core terminology. They don't always exist, but where possible, we've used those. There are also options, usually later in the section, or if not at the end of the framework, to add further detail as free text as well. There's detailed definitions and guidance for most of the questions, where they're not self-evident. And this helps to ensure some consistency across different users. They're interpreting questions and responses in the same kind of way. And there's also some example data at the end, just to make things super clear. But just before we finish, I want to comment on a few ways we see the framework being used. One is as a basis for this data entry and visualization platform that we want to develop. And here the framework really, as it is, becomes the data framework, the data structure for this platform. Second option is that other projects can take the whole framework or sections of the framework and use those to report on their own projects. Maybe they just take the action section or the cost section and use that to structure their reporting in their paper, in their reports. And then finally, there's no reason why people can't you take bits of the framework and add their own new questions, responses, sections to the framework, tailored to their specific project, their specific reporting needs. Ideally, the core framework, the core questions stay the same. So we build up that core database. But by all means, new questions, responses, sections can be added. So I'll end with a very quick summary. So we've co-developed a unified framework for recording invasive species management projects, and this should mobilize and standardize data on invasive species management in the future. So then finally, just some next steps for the framework for our project. First is to carry out the final review with the workshop participants and publish the framework hopefully early next year. We want to work on developing the online platform for data entry and visualization and populate the database underlying it, assuming we can get some further funding for that. Even with funding, that's going to be a massive task, so we're more than happy to collaborate with people. We can all create our own specific databases on particular taxonomic groups, habitats, locations. And if we're all using the same common framework, we can stitch those together into a massive global database at the end, which is super, super exciting. Please get in touch if that interests you, and we can work out how to move forward. That's about all my time. So I'd just like to say thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay. Thank you, Nigel, for this presentation. It's also good to know that the management framework that Nigel just presented is actually one of the use cases for the TDWG task group. So I've been deep diving into the data, which has resulted in the results of the first presentation. And with that being said, I would like to introduce Cristina for a presentation on invasive alien species management data in Romania. It's here. Where is it? Sorry.
Yeah, you have to really adjust it for me. Hola, me llamo Cristina, soy rumena, estoy encantada de estar aquí. And now that I butchered Spanish, I will switch to English and talk to you about the mobilization of biodiversity data for invasive species management in Romania. I started off with a couple of definitions, but I'm pretty much looking out in the room. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. So I will just skip to this interesting report that Hanno also mentioned, the IPBES Invasive Alien Species Thematic Report, that has some interesting figures around. So I know that some people here in the room actually contributed to the report, but unless you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to have a look and read. It makes for an interesting read, a couple hundred pages, but also like a summary of 50 pages. So depending on how much time, maybe on your flight back to Europe for the Europeans or for the other continents, you can have a look at it. So yeah, we have a problem, a big challenge, and very global in scope. But I will nonetheless focus on Europe as a study case maybe, and not necessarily on Europe, but particularly on my country, because as the figures show, the graph doesn't look like this problem is going away anytime soon. So just a bit of a background. In Europe, we are aligned with the global initiatives that were also mentioned before, like Target 6 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Specifically, in the European Union, we have a regulation that has been around for 10 years or so. Of the European Parliament and of the Council, which is focused on the prevention and management of the introduction and spread of invasive alien species. At the core of this regulation, there's a list, the so-called list of invasive alien species of union concern. In order for a species to end up on this list, it has to be assessed, and this is a very detailed and tedious, long process. There's a set of criteria that is mentioned in the regulation, based on which these assessments are performed, criteria that relates to the impact, the spread, the management of said species. And these risk assessments are reviewed then by the scientific forum and by the Invasive Alien Species Committee, and also by the public in the end. It has started out as a list, sorry, of 30-something species, 36 if I remember correctly. But then throughout the time, as years passed, there were some updates. The latest one is the update that occurred in August 2025, which led the number of species on this list up to 114 species, including animals and plants. So 65 animals and 49 plants. What is interesting with this list is that once the species end up on it, all the member states of the European Union are expected to do something about it. So there are restrictions, measures, again, set out in the regulations regarding the keeping, the importing, selling, breeding, growing, releasing into the environment. You're not allowed to do any of that. So member states need to take action on pathways to avoid the introduction, if that is a possibility. So to prevent the actual introduction of invasive species. Also to take measures for the early detection and rapid eradication of these species, or if the species is already present in that particular country, quite widespread, then they have to manage somehow to keep it contained as far as possible to avoid further spread. So you can see on the map there, the species of union concern that have been observed in the European context, and the star, the golden star, is just to show you where I come from. That's my hometown, the city of Constanța. I'm based at Ovidius University in Constanța, and I'm interested in this subject. So speaking of my country, I'm not sure how much of knowledge you have about my country. We are the homeland of Dracula. That's Dracula. He's based in Transylvania, so we are protecting him with the Carpathians. We are the 12th largest country in Europe, which means we are, I Googled it, about 5 times smaller than Colombia in surface. We are 19 million Romanians, and also I Googled Bogota with the surroundings has an 11 million population, so easily could host half the population of Romania. And we also speak Romanian, which is a Romance language, so it's similar to Spanish. Now you know why I tried to introduce myself in Spanish. The Carpathians, they protect Dracula, but also they are like 2,500 meters tall, so half the height of the Andes. The Danube River is our natural border to in the south to Serbia and Bulgaria. Danube Delta, lovely area, come check it out. And we also have a coast at the Black Sea, roughly 250 kilometers, including gold sand beaches. Europe's largest brown bear population, an extensive natural forest. But what I've seen here is amazing. We don't have hummingbirds. sadly. Coming back to the legislation part, the more boring part. What have we tried to do because we are a member state of the European Union, we are trying to do the implementation of this rule in Romania, but we have some challenges because the data is quite scattered in different sources, not necessarily machine readable. So some of the reports are just physical reports or PDF format or whatever. Therefore, it's not standardized. There are different ways of recording species names or the protocol used to gather the information. Therefore, slightly unfair, let's say. And this is where we come in. So what we try to do in the past years is to somehow gather all this data together, centralize it, and standardize it as far as possible. Get rid of synonyms, duplicates, check out the coordinates, everything, clean up a little bit the mess. So we ended up with a list of roughly 760 alien species that occur in Romania, with occurrence records assigned to each of these species. So we have now a database of roughly 220,000 occurrence records, among these 760 alien species, we have 29 species of union concern that we need to really manage. I won't go into details about the species of national concern because we can have that as well. So we tried to make the data more fair and more open, more accessible. I listed there just two of the projects, the national projects that we have had running. One of them has ended, the management of invasive species in Romania. That's Romanian. Maybe you can read it. Spanish-speaking people. That ended a couple of years ago, but we had the support of the Ministry of Environment in Romania, which was awesome. So we tried to do, and European Union funding. So we tried to do this cleaning up of the database. Response project doesn't have a specific focus on invasive alien species, but it does have a work package that is aimed at these biological invasions. So most of the species on the list, I should mention that, are plants, and the next group is insects. And now I will just give you, again, a case study, an example about the alien invertebrates, which is the group I'm most familiar with, what I'm working on specifically. And you can see here the data coming from different sources, published data, field work, and also citizen science in the different realms, terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. Maybe I should just mention that citizen science is not such a big thing in Romania yet. We're working on it as well. We're trying to convince people to use apps like iNaturalist that feeds data into GBIF rather than Facebook or anything else. Instagram, and you can see that 10 of the species, of the 300 species of alien invertebrates, have come from records provided by the citizen scientists. We are trying to establish, as Quentin mentioned earlier, a checklist, a baseline, so to have knowledge of the situation, current situation in Romania. Here I just put some examples of the maps for the freshwater invertebrates. The difference between the maps, they are quite similar. I realize that now. Difference is that one of them shows occurrences, the other one shows species richness. And this is what we are trying to use to identify hotspots, to see major pathways of introduction. Again, I just put an example linking the pathways of introduction with the main donor regions, let's say, native ranges of the species we identified in Romania. We are trying to make all of this really friendly, user-friendly, with a dashboard that will be available with a paper as an appendix. So all the records that you've seen before can be seen here as well, with data attribution for each record, and also like a menu that allows you to filter the information to see, for example, in this case, we have 3 species of union concern of alien invertebrates in Romania. And then you can have some statistics, some summaries related. I don't expect you to read what's written over there. It's just a list of species, top 10 by counties, top 10 by families, things like that. You can play around and customize and download all of this data. Here at the occurrence accumulation curve, I think the peak suggests when we started cooperating with the Ministry of Environment and they took us seriously. And then we had centralized all the data at the national level. So yeah, this is what we are trying to do, improve the openness and fairness of our data. Maybe Lien was talking about automated workflows. So we will try to do that within one stop to find a way maybe to have this checklist maintained long-term and also updated. Not manually like we did it now, but maybe automated. We have begin our process of joining the GBIF network, but we'll see where that goes. Hopefully the policy brief that Quentin prepared will help with that. Is available in multiple languages, including Romanian. We still have a long way to go. I realize that. There's still lots of knowledge gaps. We don't have information on all taxa, no information on abundance or impact at a local scale or at national scale for that matter. But we are trying to at least improve the management efficiency and have this policy implementation data-driven. I'm done. I'm good. Yes. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Cristina. So we're going to continue on this presentation marathon without any room for questions. But again, please find us after the session if you have any questions at all. Our next speaker is Eduardo Arlé, who is focusing on the challenges on invasive alien species data. So I would like to call him to the floor. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. So the session is all about alien data, and I want to bring some topic that feels a bit underwater. So when we deal with marine invasions, things get a bit murkier than in the land. So this work is part of the collaboration I'm doing with Iris Prijs, Anton Kovalev, Jonathan Bellmaker, and Gil Rilov from 2 universities in Israel, from the university where I was doing my postdoc until August, the Tel Aviv University, and from the Limnological and Marine Research Center in Haifa. So, oh, sorry. Living in Israel, we get used to put to the wrong side of the slide. So I might come back trying to go in front sometimes because it reads back forth. So we need reliable data for every single stage of invasion research. We need good records to understand where the species are. And these records have to come fast so that we can go there and do something about it. Many times the automated protocols that we have to identify errors in science, citizen science, and new data that is put into GBIF might automatically flag an outlier as an error, and those might not be errors. Those might be a first records of an alien species. So when we deal with alien science, we have to change our minds a bit from what we're doing for conservation. From the data collection to the data collation to the metadata we need, passing through all the analysis we do, and to the management, the data quality and the specificity of some points of this data in invasion biology must be very well curated, and this data has to be excellent so that we can make things work. And we all know that there is this big marine terrestrial data gap. So it makes sense. We are terrestrial species, so we live here, we breathe air. So of course, it's much easier for us to collect data in the terrestrial environment. But also, these two realms, the studies on them historically have taken a bit separate path. While in the terrestrial realm, macroecology and biogeography have developed early in these general theories and trying to find solutions that explain the functioning of the ecosystem in a whole way, sometimes even a bit too much. The marine studies tend to be much more specific to one bay or one species. There is still not this this culture and also the data and the possibility of trying to make bigger generalities about the marine environment. Apart from that, data is much more expensive to collect, especially in the deeper regions, also very dangerous in some parts. And since the marine big parts of the oceans are not belonging to any country, these areas are a bit overlooked. So we end up having less funding for marine research, except for when there is some oil under that. But that's another talk that I'm not going to go into that. So because of all these reasons, there is a deficit in knowledge for the marine environment. What makes this data different? So the first thing, we are dealing with three-dimensional data here. So we don't need only two coordinates, the longitude and the latitude. For most species, the depth is also important, and it's still missing a lot. The seasonality is very, very important in the marine environment. There are regions that if we observe and we take the measurements in summer, they seem very suitable for many species, but then in winter, they are completely uninhabitable for the same species. Currents drive dynamics and dispersal. So species in the marine environment, in the terrestrial realm, distance is a kind of decent proxy for invasion risk and invasion spreads. In the marine, species can spread hundreds of kilometers or not at all, depending solely on circulation. So this is also this connectivity. We have to think about that when we are trying to understand the invasion process and predict things. And climate change is warming the oceans much faster than the land. Some regions are warming like 10 times faster than regions in the land, because especially the shallow areas. So the currents are also threatened by the change in circulations. We don't know enough about that. So there are lots of layers of uncertainty in the marine. And then when we talk about invasive species in the marine realm, we have two layers of biases here. We have this double mismatch. Our data and our tools were firstly thought and developed to understand where the species are and describe nature as it is. And many tools, like the ones I use the most, the ecological niche models, they were developed for agriculture and they work very well for conservation. But then when we start applying them to invasion biology, they work less well. Also, they were developed for the land. So when we applied them for the marine, they work less well. So when we put it to marine invasions, we have those two layers of problems. And it would be very cynical to just like produce models with those amazing tools we have and like say that that's what's going to happen and not go through all the issues that we have there. So we have to tailor the data and the models that we have to fit marine invasions. There are recent tools and products of environmental layers that are fit for that. So the volume model package by Hannah Owens and Carsten Rabeck, for example, allows us to produce ecological niche models in 3D. And it was very difficult to use at the beginning because we didn't have the layers. And then Copernicus finally came with layers that we call them in our lab the lasagna data, because it comes with the layers for depth. But these layers are not, which is very good. They are not those averages that we used for SDMs for 20 years. They are projections, daily projections, which gives us a lot more opportunities, but also we have to process this data. Recently, Juan David, there are 3 Juan Davids in ecology from Colombia. I'm talking about the González Trujillo, who is now in the invasion conference in in Madeira. He put together a nice code that we can download the data for the areas where we need. And that's a very good opportunity because we can, instead of just copying the terrestrial and making those 20 years averages of the conditions, we have to do different things and test how fast the marine is changing and what are the time frames that we should use. So now we have the tools and we can start using it. But the species occurrence data remains very scarce, uncertain, very biased towards shallow waters, close to continents, close to country-owned waters. So we need to improve the data to fully use these tools and test things. So this is one example of some work that we are doing, just like a little piece of all the gigantic puzzle we have to put together. Here in the left side, you see Nigel Taylor, who is the leader of the Limnological and Marine Research Group, and two of his brilliant PhD students, Iris Price and Anton Kovalev. They are the mechanistic side of our group. So in the middle, you see Iris. I say that she's torturing the animals with something very important. She gets the species, she brings to the lab, put them in controlled condition, and check what are the limits and the ideal conditions that they can live. In this case, it's a very simple and very preliminary study. She calculated the lethal temperatures for the Diadema cetosum, is the long-spined sea urchin that is actually from the Indo-Pacific, but they are different clades and they're very different genetically. So she is using the clade that is the one that is known to have invaded the Mediterranean. There is the clade B that is native to the Red Sea and part of the Gulf of Persia. So she got the species brought to the lab and got these limits, this thermal limit. And then we ran a classical correlative model in the top, where you see this beautiful seahorse. There's the Mediterranean Sea. And for this SDM, we only use data from the native range. We didn't use any of the points from the alien range. And we ran classical SDMs, like 10 different algorithms, ensemble forecast in the end, choosing the threshold and all these things. And then we tested, we ran the models for the native region of these clades, and then we tested with the data from the invasive. So this data from the Mediterranean was not put into the model. And I was a bit frustrated because those models never work, and it worked amazingly. And I was like, okay, this time it works well. But then, very interestingly, with just the data from the thermal limits that Iris and Anton collected in the lab, without using any geographical data apart from the temperature layers, we made the bottom map and the evaluation metrics were even better. So we got an AUC of 0.925 and a TSS of 0.7. So it's still very preliminary, but it shows that for this species at least, it worked really well. Of course, we have to think that this is a case of success. Of course, I wouldn't bring all the things that we tried and didn't work to show in a conference. We're still trying to improve it. And we are dealing with a benthic species, so we don't have to worry so much about, of course, there is depth in the model, but it's a benthic species. So we are using a layer that gives us the conditions at the very bottom of each. So that's what we call a 2.5 dimension model that follows the seafloor. When we deal with pelagic species that realize vertical movements, things get a bit much more complicated. We have to account for the conditions of different depth layers, but we also have to check if the species can respond to the changes by going deep. Some species are more sensitive to pressure than others. There are lots of things that we have to put inside the models. Life history matters, and every question needs its own framework and its own specific details. So we need a marine invasive alien species toolbox. We need data collectors, data providers, modelers, and tool developers to understand that each of these things is a small part of this big toolbox. And we have to put these things together and try and test and see what works. Like, our data has to be fair, but it also has to be fit. It has to be functional, iterative, transferable, not only the data, but also all the protocols, the methods, and the our packages. We have the brains, we have some data, we have some models, and we can make all of this better. All my code is always open and on GitHub. If you want to go there, fork it, download it, break it, fix it, try to use for your things. We have to break and fix things until we bend them enough to fit into the ocean. And no lab is going to do it alone. Not even all the good labs together is going to do a perfect work, but we have to go faster than the invasions and the climate change. It's kind of a race between us and them. I had a slide to say, yes. I have to thank a bunch of people. So big thanks first to my amazing lab, the Bellmaker Lab. Couldn't ask for better friends and colleagues. Thanks also to my funding agency that allows me to go wherever I want and do whatever I want with the money they give me. To the Reyserhove Lab, they're very great collaborators. And big thanks to my previous labs where I did my PhD, my master's and everything. And especially to S-Twist, that is like my favorite SDIV working group, and also, of course, to the GBIF alien task that brought me here to Colombia. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm around the whole day.
Maybe there's room for one small question. If someone has a question, it's the moment now. Okay. So you can find Eduardo here, like this afternoon. I hope you're still here, Eduardo. Okay, great. Okay, so our next speaker is Melodie McGeoch, who is going to talk about modeling trends in biological invasions for policy reporting.
Hola, and thank you very much to the organizers for this session, Lien, Quentin, and Andrew. I'm going to be talking about modeling trends in biological invasions for policy reporting, in particular, the production of an indicator for target 6. So we've seen this text multiple times. The headline indicator for this target under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is rate of invasive alien species establishment. And that headline indicator addresses most directly the sort of central gray text of target 6, but it's also supports and is sort of an earlier stage of the invasion process related indicator for the other two parts of the target. So it is good in the sense that it's quite a good overarching individual indicator. However, words on a page do not an indicator make. And so we need to look at, although this is called for as an indicator, such an indicator doesn't exist. And this is some work done by Joanna Vincente a couple of years ago, where Joanna and the team, we reviewed all metrics that had been suggested as useful for monitoring invasions and all indicators that had been developed for biological invasions were reviewed across multiple criteria that are the basis of a robust indicator. And so the longer the bar on this diagram, each of these little slices is an individual publication. You can see there are not too many of them. And they divided here into the sort of DIPSA framework, the driver pressure state response framework, which is what was used for reporting on the Aichi target. So the longer the bar, the more criteria an indicator or suggested metric meets for a robust indicator. So this headline indicator is a type of pressure indicator because rates of invasion are telling you something about the size of the problem, the size of the pressure of invasion, and how that's changing over time. So if we take just the top 3 suggested metrics and indicator, these 3 publications on the right there, they meet the most criteria for robust indicators in terms of either metrics or the indicator itself. And if we look into what those papers suggest, some of them are really for measuring impact rather than rates of introduction and establishment. And the overarching message from these is that although invasion trends is an intuitive indicator, its calculation requires very careful consideration of different forms of bias, including inherent lags in the invasion process. And in fact, the paper by John Wilson, who assessed national relevance of indicators, basically concludes that trends in invasion is not a practical indicator at the national level. Nonetheless, that is what we have identified, and so we need to start making some progress. So although trends have not been sort of published as a suggested indicator in the past or really developed, we do have a range of progress in the scientific arena that can be brought together to produce this headline indicator. So a fundamental contribution to the headline indicator 6.1 is the information that's been collated. A lot of this was led by Hanno Seebens and colleagues on essentially what we can think of as a discovery record. So these are trends in a very recent paper that is related to Chapter 2 of the IPBES assessment. Shows, and this is just for the Americas, but these data are available for all regions. And this shows the numbers of discovered established alien species essentially over time. And this is a very key input into the headline indicator. So the reason for the hesitancy, I guess, in terms of using trends in invasion and change it from which one would calculate rate of change in invasion as an indicator has to do with this, the lag in the discovery, or the lag between the introduction and establishment and discovery of alien species. And so this figure in a paper by Hezi Buba and colleagues shows very nicely what the problem is. So on the left, the black line illustrates a constant introduction rate. So let's just assume we're getting the same numbers of new alien species establishing every year. The dotted lines underpin it show 3 different scenarios for effectiveness of detection. So the top 2 show a much higher level of detection. The bottom one, of course, is a low level of detection. But regardless of those very different scenarios of detection effectiveness, if you like, if you look on the right, as soon as you start to estimate trends, you'll find that they're all positive, but their shapes are slightly different, and their rates might not be accurate because of this lag in detection. So this is the key, I guess, scientific challenge underpinning the production of the headline indicator. Fortunately, we are in a position to produce this indicator thanks to over a decade's worth of work from many, many individual researchers and supported by multiple intergovernmental agencies and initiatives, GBON, GBIF, GRIS, AppleLife, IPBES, IDIV, et cetera, S-Twist. And it's really been to try to complete this sort of information flow and to sort of put in place steps so that we can pull all of this together for the purpose of producing an indicator. So we have checklists, we have first records, we have ways of checking data quality, we have models, we have data standards, we have infrastructures, and we have science policy engagement. So the timing is good right now. That doesn't mean it's still necessarily straightforward. There's still work to do to produce this actual indicator. So we're busy working on this at the moment using some published models for estimating the rates of introduction and establishment. And I'm just going to talk today about the naive model and the sampling model. So the naive model basically assumes perfect detection It ignores the fact that there might be a lag in detection. It's a generalized linear model with a Poisson link. And there's the Sola and Costello model, which assumes that the probability of detection of a species increases consistently and exponentially because over time there's more chance of detecting something, and also because alien species populations are growing, you're more likely to detect it, and that's a bit of an exponential function. So, and that is based, the good thing about the Sola and Costello model is it explicitly considers both the actual introduction rate and the detection in the same model. So the sampling model is based on the Sola and Costello model, but adds a new function, which is really good, which allows the sample effort or detection probability to change over time. So these are all published. You can have a look at these papers. So what I'm going to show you now is some examples of testing these models in the Antarctic context. So in some work done by Arlé, we collaborated to estimate or to test the models and to estimate rates of introduction and establishment in the Antarctic and across the subantarctic islands. So the example I'm showing here is for the New Zealand subantarctic islands. On the left, if you just look at the blue line, this is the proxy of survey effort that goes into the sampling model, and you can use multiple different proxies of sample effort. In this case, the proxy is, for all the results I'll show you, is the number of field visits to that particular locality. So we sort of assume that the more field visits there are, the more likely you are to detect a new alien species. If we look on the right-hand side, the purple line is the sampling model, and the red modeled line with uncertainty is the naive model. And first of all, for this particular location, well, it's actually the sum of the New Zealand subantarctic islands. The naive model was not significant. So in other words, it suggests that there'd be no change in the introduction rate. The sampling model, however, showed that there was a declining trend, and it estimates the B1S is the sampling model, and that's the rate parameter. So, I mean, the good thing is that both the naive model and the sampling model show a decline, which means they agree on the slope of the curve, the direction of the slope. But the sampling model suggests that there is actually declining rate of invasion. And the M value gives, on average, across the period from 1990, and this is done in 5-year intervals, there have been about 5 new alien species established per 5-year period across these localities. So that's one example. Just to show you another example, this is for the Antarctic continent itself. Again, we have the sampling proxy on the left. And on the right, you can see in this case that the sampling model and the naive model actually agree. The naive model was significant, but in this case, it shows an increasing rate of establishment of alien species in the region. Both the sampling model and naive model agree. Again, there's about, on average, across the period from 1900, there's been an average of about 5.3 aliens introduced and established every 5-year period. And the rates, you can see both B values are actually positive. So invasion seems to be on an upward trend in the Antarctic, on a downward trend across the New Zealand subantarctic islands. So this is the sort of approach that we're busy working on. And as I stand here now, the models are running for all countries to produce headline indicator 6. So it's less straightforward than it might at first appear, even though it might not at first appear straightforward. But the sorts of considerations that need to be thought about carefully are the length of the time series you use, what is policy relevant, what is statistically suitable, the completeness of the data. It's never fully complete. How do you deal with that? How do you account for it? What taxonomic focus? What do you want to include, exclude from a realm and taxonomic perspective? And how can you actually automate this workflow? And none of these decisions can be taken in isolation. All of them have to consider the purpose of this indicator, the data properties, the workflow steps, and the ecological assumptions all have to be considered at every step of the process in producing this indicator. And that's it. And I'd really like to thank an enormous number of researchers who've built the work necessary to actually do this over time, and the many agencies who've supported us. Thank you.
Okay, there's maybe time for one short question. Or maybe everyone's just hungry and tired. That's also an option. So our next speaker is Manuela Gómez-Suárez on standardizing and integrating alien species distribution data.
So hi everyone, I'm Manuela Gómez. I'm happy to be presenting here in my home country. So right now I'm based in Germany and I'm doing my PhD. And together with Hanno Seebens and Philip Leseke, we've been working on CINAS, which is a workflow and a dataset for exploring alien species biogeographic trajectories. So Hanno mentioned already that he was working with CINAS. So it's been published or it's been available for some time, but this is like the newer and cooler version. So I don't think I have to give a big introduction on alien species. We've been talking about them for about an hour or more, but I brought a cool example of one of those. That's the hippo, which may be super cool in his home country in Africa, or continent in Africa, in multiple countries. But here in Colombia, where it was introduced in the 80s, it has been causing a lot of impact around the Magdalena River. So we can just move on. So we do agree, all of us, that the introduction of species is a pressing issue, and we expect this issue to increase in the coming years. So there's been multiple assessments which project an increase of alien species introductions in a couple of years. And this issue has been pushing a lot of research efforts on alien species. For example, we have this figure from the IPBES assessment on alien species, on invasive alien species, which shows the regions where alien species have been introduced. So we see, for example, for the marine and terrestrial species, we see like darker spots on the map around more temperate regions. So in Northern America, Europe, Oceania. And the IPBES assessment also shows some data gaps. I hope I'm small, I'm not covering anything. So back there, we see that we still have a lot of missing information on the regions of introduction, mostly on Africa and Southern Asia. So there's another data gap that we found when working with this data, and it's about the regions where alien species are native, so the regions of origin. And this knowledge gap was kind of the motivation for expanding CINAS, which, as I already mentioned, is a dataset for compiling information not only on the alien distributions of alien species, but also on their native distributions. So how did we work on CINAS? We first collected a bunch of data on different sources, which are already published. So we have a lot of databases which are informing us about the alien distributions of alien species, so their introduced ranges. We also have some databases which are informing us about the native distributions of alien species. And we have some few databases which are informing us about both the native and alien distributions of alien species. So we gather all of this data. These ones are usually available in the form of checklists. So we already heard those are like lists of countries informing whether a species is present or not. And some of these databases were providing information in the form of range maps, which we then converted into checklists to be able to introduce them or incorporate them in the workflow to standardize them. So after collecting all of this data, we standardize it. So those were the variables that we were interested in, and we standardized them using the Darwin Core terminology, which are standards for sharing biodiversity data, and also using the recommendations of Groom and his colleagues, which are more specifically about sharing data on alien species. So we standardize this data using translation tables. So they're pretty much, so we have on the left the old terms and on the right the new terms, and we are just like keeping the new standardized terms. So the variables that we kept, as I mentioned, are shown there. So the establishment means were like our most important variable because it's the one that tells us whether a species is native or introduced in an area. We also have information on the occurrence status, so whether a species is present or absent right now. For some species, we could gather information on their habitat. And the last three categories are more specifically, like they only concern the alien distributions of alien species. So on the degree of establishment. So for example, whether a species is reproducing or already established in a location, the pathway of introduction, and the year of introduction. So it looks a little bit like this. And I hope, again, I'm not covering anything. So we have some examples on the original, the information of the original data sets. So it's kind of messy and all over the place. And we, in this case, we standardize all of these terms into introduce. And this is being fed in the establishment means column, for example. So after standardizing this, we standardize the locations. So we also use a translation table. We include in our data set 289 locations, which encompass all world countries and key sub-regions. And this one looks a little bit like this. For example, for the United States, they are all reporting these names like in a completely different way. We are also upscaling region names, department names. For example, for Colombia, we have all of the departments, Antioquia, Cundinamarca, Boyacá, etc. And we are upscaling them to Colombia in this case. So we have for each one of these regions a table with all the possible variations. So you can imagine how big, how huge this table looks like. And at the end, we are able to standardize all of these regions into 289 locations. After standardizing this, we also standardize the taxon names of the species after the GBIF backbone taxonomy. And at the end, we integrated all of these records into CINAS. So CINAS includes over 400,000 records. It includes over 170,000 records for over 40,000 alien species, the alien distributions for over 40,000 alien species. And we have around or over 240,000 records on the native distributions for over 20,000 species. So we can take a little bit closer look into how the data set looks like. So we have the amount of taxa included in the data set. So we have a lot of information on on vascular plants. So this is the taxonomic group, which has been more widely introduced around the globe. And now more specific, like in the alien distributions, we also have good information for insects, for vertebrates, and also we have some information for smaller taxa and some microorganisms. Regarding the native distributions, we could find good information on vascular plants, on vertebrates, and on ants, but the information for other arthropods groups is very scarce, and of course also for smaller taxonomic groups and microorganisms, we couldn't get our hands around it. So we can look a little bit at the completeness of each variable within the data set. So the information on establishment means is full. So all of our records have the information whether a species in a location is native or introduced. We also have quite good information on the occurrence status. And then on the three last variables, which are specifically on the alien distributions, we have for around half of our records, the information on the year of introduction. We have good-ish information on the degree of establishment, but we have very few information on the pathway of introduction for the species. We can also take a brief look and yes, on the years of introductions, and we see, we can see the introductions over the past 70 years, and we see still a steep increase on the introductions, and we also can see that the reporting is still lacking for the past 5 years, so it still has to catch up. We can also take a brief look on how these records are distributed around the globe. So on the top, we see the alien distributions of alien species. So again, the regions of introductions. And we see that most species have been introduced in temperate areas, so Northern America, Europe, and Oceania. That's the same figure or very similar as the one shown in or plotted in the IPBES, Invasive Alien Species Assessment. And we can also take a look at how the native distributions are distributed around the globe. So again, those are the origin places of the alien species. And we see that they are more evenly distributed around the globe. And there's also a lot of biodiversity-rich countries which are donating a lot of alien species. So there's a lot of opportunities now with the data set. So it allows the identification of emerging alien species through horizon scans or predictive modeling. Also the identification of major routes of spread, the allocation of point records. So if we have occurrence data, we could see if we can allocate these occurrence points to either native or alien distributions. And it also provides information to achieve global biodiversity targets. Of course, we have some challenges. For example, the lack of centralization of data. We found very good databases, but there's probably millions of records still scattered, or I don't know if millions, hundreds of records still scattered in scientific literature and gray literature. There are paywalls or restrictive licenses behind the resources, which makes getting into the data a little bit more difficult. The inconsistency in the usage of terms and formatting of data. So for example, for us, it was much easier to standardize data which was already provided, like text strings, for example, for the information and establishment means, whether it was introduced or native. But we had some databases which were providing the information. So the column was called introduced and it was in zeros and ones. And we have to convert all of this into text strings to be able to standardize this data. And of course, the geographic and taxonomic gaps that we all know when working with biodiversity data, and it's just something that we have to acknowledge when using this kind of information. So I wanted to bring a small example of what I've been working with now with the data set, and it's about the native distributions of alien species. So why the native distributions? It's because we already have good studies on the alien distributions of alien species. For example, there's the study of Dawson and his colleagues where they ask themselves, what makes a country a significant recipient of alien species? And they found that high GDP, high population density, and bigger areas mean more alien species introductions. So we asked the same question about the native distributions. So what makes a country a significant donor of alien species? For this, we built a linear mix model. And this is very preliminary, so please take it with a pinch of salt. So we look at different categories or different variables for our biggest taxonomic groups, or the taxonomic groups for which we have more information. So vascular plants, fish, birds, reptiles, and mammals. And we look in this case at precipitation, colonial activity, population density, GDP, temperature, and native species richness. And I don't want to stay super long on this because it's still, as I mentioned, on the words. But what really strikes the most is the huge effect that native species richness has on the amount of outgoing or donated alien species. This means that biodiversity-rich regions are the ones which are like exporting kind of most alien species in the world. We were also a little bit impressed about the negative effect of GDP per capita on the amount of donated alien species, but we believe it's just because the big effect that this native species richness has. So biodiversity-rich countries are usually the ones that are less wealthy or have less GDP. So we think that's why we see this like contradictory result in comparison with the alien distributions of alien species. And now to summarize, so CNAS is almost completely out. So we have the dataset already in Zenodo, and we have the workflow on GitHub, and the data descriptor is probably coming out soon. There's still a lot of information missing. So I've been playing with the idea of working with LLMs to extract information on the native distributions, which we are still missing in the dataset, but hasn't happened yet. And still, if you know some databases or datasets where I can get more information on the native distributions of alien species, I would be very happy to hear about it. I also wanted to encourage you to use standards to share your data. It makes the life of everyone way easier, and it also ensures that your data is being used for further research on global assessments. And then I would like to end up with Yeah, so CNAS opens a lot of opportunities for research on emerging alien species, also major routes of spread and the native distributions of alien species. And that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks. Any questions? We have time for one. Damiano?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the presentation. Just a small question. I'm curious about how many, every day, your occurrence data come to GB, for example. So if I understand it, you publish this dataset on Zenodo
Yes.
with occurrence data. How frequent do you plan to update this dataset?
So I think it probably depends on how much data we can get our hands on and whether, I mean, it's pretty easy to upload or not to upload, to actualizar, to update, thank you, the data set, because the workflow is already there. So I think if we get good data that can improve the data set, it would be rather easy to update it. So I think it depends on how much data we get in the next months, years.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. And with that, I would like to introduce our last speaker. I have to admit that I didn't prepare very properly, so I'm going to try to pronounce your name. I'm going to introduce Hervé Goëau on adopting a single species plant identification model for multi-species detection of invasive alien plants in roadside imagery.
Thank you very much. It's okay. So yes, thank you. I'm Hervé Goëau from from Sierrade, France. And today we'll present the work done with the PlantNet team and in a collaboration with the Aarhus University from Denmark in the context of the Mambo and Guardian European project. And I have to say I'm a little confused about this presentation because it's not about standard or framework for managing plant species, but we'll go back to the source to detect massively invasive species in the context of roads. So the roads are key corridors for invasive alien species spread. And so monitoring at scale, it's very difficult. And if it could be a good idea to put some cameras on cars to try to monitor that at scale. But here, sorry. But the difficulty then you will have a lot of different landscape, a lot of different habitats according to different regions. And so it will be difficult to have an approach that generalizes among all these different contexts. So we have also opportunities. Now we have these great citizen science platforms such as PlantNet, such as eNaturalist, with millions of single species images. They are thanks to these images, we can build global models effective for close-ups and single plant images. If we consider landscape and images that we can see in roadsides, we could imagine traditional detection approaches such as object detection, but then it will be very costly to make some annotation and it will be most of the time limited to few species. So here, the opportunity is to adapt a global plant ID models for multi-species roadside imagery. For that, we experiment several methods on the Danish road dataset, which contains 14,000 high-resolution images collected on a high-speed camera. We focus on 6 invasive taxa common in Denmark, and 44 of the images contain no invasive species. And here we can see the strong domain shift we have to deal with, because on the right, you can see the typical Danish roads, so high resolution images. And then we can see the PlantNet knowledge, the PlantNet dataset we use for identifying these species. And we can see all our close-ups with flowers, organs, different organs, leaves and fruits. So we have to deal with this great domain shift. So for this experiment, we use the PlantNet model that was deployed last year. So I will not dive into the details, but it's a vision transformer model pre-trained with a self-supervised learning approach called BAIT. And so just a few information about that. So before, for image classification, we use convolutional neural networks. Now we use visual transformer. And the advantage of this approach, then you can pre-train a model with many images without any labels. So what we call the SSL approach. And then you can use that and fine-tune on your data. For, in our case, it was a 6.6 images and fine-tune for identifying 44,000 plant species. The input size is 384 by 384. It's important. And so it's optimized for single species. So then once you have this great model for single plants, we have to adapt it for global roadside imagery. And we explore two different approaches. So first is the VAMIS approach. It means that you can force the model to analyze big images. So you have to know, so you will have two issues with that. You will have memory issues because you have to know that a vision transformer is based on the analysis of small patches, small fixed patches. And so you will explode the memory with big images. But and you will have also another issue that because it uses internal representation called positional encoding, and so the model is not aware about new position in wider images. So you will have a decrease of the performances. And the other approach is basically, as you can expect, use a tiling approach. It means that you take the big images and then you crop several small images at the size of the input of the model. You can do that at several scales because you don't know if the invasive species will be small or big. And so you do plenty of image prediction. And then at the end, you aggregate to have the set of proposed, the top predicted species. So first, we try to compare these two methods without any fine-tuning, just using directly the global model, the global content model on this roadside views. What we can see that the VAMIS approach underperform. So it's because probably about this issue with the partial encoding interpolation. While we have a good surprise with the tiling approach, we have a strong generalization. We reach a balanced accuracy. So a balance means averages among the taxa. And so it means that we can detect 85% of the plant species, the invasive species. And it's also interesting to see that with dedicated approaches such as YOLO, which is a classic way to detect objects, we have lower performances, and the same with classical convolutional neural networks. Then, sorry, no water. When we can try to, no, it's okay. Then what we can do is then it's more to try to fine-tune the model on this specific set of invasive data. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, it's okay. So the next step is try to, if we can improve the performances, if we fine-tune our global model to this specific task of 6 taxa. So what we can see that yes, with the tiling, we can increase from 85 to 92% of good detection. And also the good news is that the VAMIS approach, which is less expensive, you can greatly improve the performances. Actually, you can reach the same performances of the tiling. So to complete this study, we can see also that the VAMIS is faster. Actually, the tiling approach is 35 times slower than the VAMIS approach. So according to this result, now if you want to apply that in the real world, because here it's just a study, you have to choose a compromise. Do you want to have the best performances, but do you want to manage several places in the world, like several countries in Europe? Are you able to manage I don't know, 20 models if you want to address 20 countries in the same time? So this is why, for us, we continue this experiment at the real scale, at the real scale, by choosing the tiling approach, meaning without fine-tuning our model to this different context. So for that, we have done a demonstration. You can try the link. So it's an interface. So it's a work done in the context of the Biodiversity Plus project. So here, thanks to many partners, we analyze many kilometers, and here we can see the interface with detected invasive species along a road with an intensity. When you have a red one, it means that you have probably invasive species, like here with Alianthus altissima, typically. And so this is the first result for our first operational system. We have 12 partners across Europe. We monitored 60 species. It's about 2,000 kilometers of road. It represents more than 2 million of images analyzed. And yes. So just to have to know, to do that, it was 1 year full-time for one dedicated computer. And it was about 8 kilometers per day, what was analyzed. So just to finish, so roadside are difficult to monitor at scale. We can use a generalist plant model without costly and time-consuming local acquisition. Despite the strong domain shift, you can improve the performances with moderate fine-tuning, but then you have to manage a more demanding infrastructure for that. And so tiling provides the best accuracy, and there is, of course, a room of improvement for the performances and also for the time of predictions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think it was a very relevant presentation. Any questions? Sorry, Quentin, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's very exciting work into the detection. I wonder if you thought any about how we can use this practically. Would we use it for monitoring change, or would it be for use in finding species we want to control, or have you thought beyond that?
I guess both of the scenario are okay. I mean, the basic idea is to, I would say, to check and to manage directly, but then we can take all these outputs of this massive occurrences to do more bigger analysis, I guess. Mm-hmm.
This may be a bit crazy, but I look at your high resolution images on roadways and I think about who else is taking high resolution images of roadways across the entire world. Google. Yes. Right? Mm-hmm. This sounds like a project and a good thing to talk to them to see if you can analyze those plants that are across. I mean, they're fairly high resolution, maybe not amazing, but for a model, it might be pretty cool.
Yes, I can just say yes.
More questions? Okay, so with that, I think we just had a final presentation. I would like to just take the last 2 minutes of fame for this conference here. So first of all, I would like to thank Quentin and Andrew for co-convening this session. I would also like to bring to your attention the GBIF task group on invasive alien species. So we are working on data standards for invasive alien species. So collaboration with the TDWG task group, but also identifying gaps in the data, making bridges, but also working on the science policy interface, so linking out to IUCN, to GRIS, to other very relevant initiatives. So lots of members are here in the room, so maybe you can just stand up so people can see who was involved. Hanno, so Yeah, sorry, I put you on the spot here, but so people know who to contact. And we're having a short coming together, if you like, just to talk a bit more about invasive alien species. And I would like to thank you all for your interest. I'm very happy to see so many faces here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Oh, Quentin has something to say. Did I forget something?
I just want to welcome you all to Belgium. Next year is NeoBiota 2026. I don't have the dates, but I know that Lynn has. Does somebody have the dates? It's in September. Lynn, the dates of NeoBiota.
NeoBiota is 7 to 11 of September.
Yeah, Belgium's a wonderful place. I'm sure you'll enjoy being there. Not quite as wonderful as Bogota, but it's in Brussels. Yeah, sorry. Thank you.